I don't know how long I had been standing there before she looked up. All I know is that when her eyes found mine through the low wooden fence, her hand still gripping a trellis pole that was leaning the wrong way, she didn't scream, and she didn't flinch. She just stood there in the porch light, steady as still water, and said, calm as anything, if you want to do it, just come. My coffee had gone cold in my hand. The grass was wet against my bare feet. Somewhere behind her, a piece of wood knocked softly against another piece of wood, and for one long second, neither of us said a single word. I just stood there, caught, feeling something move in my chest that I did not have a name for yet, and would not have one for a long time after. My name is Andre Coleman. I am 33 years old, and I live in Ginter Park, a quiet corner of Richmond, Virginia, full of 100-year-old craftsman houses and oak trees, old enough to remember a different century. It is the kind of block where people learn your name early and never bother you with too many questions after that. For a long time, that suited me fine, because I did not have very many answers I wanted to give. I spent 11 years in the Army as a combat medic. A blast outside Kandahar left me with two permanent souvenirs. The first is a ringing in my right ear that never fully goes silent. Not once. Not even now. The second is a sleep pattern that shattered into pieces the night of that explosion and never quite found its way back together. Most nights I wake at least twice, usually once around 11 and again somewhere close to 3 in the morning, my heart going before my mind even catches up to why. The doctors call it trauma-related insomnia. I call it the toll I still pay for making it home when other men did not. After I got out, I turned the shed behind my house into a proper workshop and started restoring old wooden furniture, tables, cabinets, chairs that families brought me, because they could not bear to throw them out. The work asks for patience down to the millimeter, sanding with the grain, matching stain by eye until it disappears into the old wood, like it was never damaged at all. It is the only thing that has ever quieted my hands, and some nights, for an hour or two, it quiets my head as well. My marriage to a woman named Monica lasted 3 years and ended 2 years before that night at the fence. Near the end, she told me I lived like a shadow in my own house, that she could be sitting 3 feet from me and still feel like she was alone in the room. I did not argue with her. I still do not argue with her, even now, because she was not wrong. I had learned how to disappear without ever leaving. 2 doors down lives a widow named Eleanor Pruitt, 70 years old, sharp as anything, who brings me cookies most Sunday afternoons and calls me the quiet one like it is an official title. She is the only person on this street who knows I used to be a soldier. I never gave her the details, and to her credit, she never once asked for them. That was how most of my relationships worked back then, warm on the surface and closed off 2 inches under it. The house beside mine sat empty for almost a year after its owner, a man named Howard, passed away. Then, about 10 months before that night at the fence, somebody moved in. I did not walk over and introduce myself. That was never something I did, not with new neighbors, not with almost anyone. I only knew from a distance that it was a young woman with brown hair, living alone, unloading boxes by herself on a Saturday morning while I pretended not to notice from my own porch. Richmond gets humid in a way that settles into your bones by July, and by the time September rolled around that year, the evenings had finally started cooling off enough that I could sit out on the porch without sweating through my shirt. I liked those hours best, the light going soft and orange over the rooftops, the cicadas finally quieting down for the night, my tools laid out clean on the bench behind me, waiting for morning. The first thing I actually noticed about her had nothing to do with her face. It was her schedule. She did not garden in the daylight the way everyone else on the block did. She gardened close to midnight, right in that window when my body insisted on waking itself up again whether I wanted it to or not. Almost every night, I would carry my cold coffee out to the porch, waiting for my eyes to grow heavy enough to try sleep a second time, and I would see her porch light glowing gold through the gap in the fence, and her shape kneeling low over freshly turned dirt. I told myself it was not my business. I told myself that more nights than I can count. But that light kept finding me before I even meant to look for it, and some part of me had started listening for the sound of her trowel in the dirt, the way other people listen for a phone ringing. That night, after she caught me standing there with my ruined coffee and my caught breath, I climbed over the low fence and helped her set the trellis post straight where it had started to lean. She told me the plant was a moonflower vine, the kind that only opens once the sun has gone all the way down and stayed down. Her father used to grow them in this exact yard, she said, and she had planted a new one here so that something would bloom every single night, instead of the yard just sitting there in darkness with nothing alive in it. I asked why she was out at midnight instead of during the day, like it was any of my business, and she laughed a little, brushing dirt off her palms. Day shift nursing job, she said. I don't get home until 8 most nights. Showers done by 9. This right here is the only hour that belongs to me. It made sense. It was the kind of plain, practical answer that did not ask anything of me in return, and something about that honesty made it easier to stay a little longer than I planned to. After that first night, something started between us that neither of us gave a name to for a long while. Some nights, when I woke up and saw her porch light burning gold through the fence, I would carry my coffee out and sit on my side. She would bring her tea and sit on hers. We would talk across that low wooden line until one of us finally felt tired enough to try sleeping again. Nobody scheduled it. Nobody promised anything out loud. It just kept happening, night after night. The way water finds the same low path in the ground without anyone ever digging the channel for it. Her name was Natalie Shaw. She told me things slowly, in pieces, the careful way people do when they are still deciding whether you are safe enough to trust with the whole picture. She was a hospice nurse, the kind who sits with people through the last stretch of their lives, holding their hands when their own families cannot bear to. When her father had been dying, she used to drive up from Norfolk nearly every weekend during his final year, cooking him soup, changing his bandages, reading paperback westerns to him in the evenings because they were the only thing that kept his mind from wandering. One night, almost offhand, stirring her tea like it was nothing at all, she said something that stopped me cold. Every time I came up to see my dad, I used to see you out here, sanding something on your porch or carrying groceries in for Miss Eleanor. You never once looked up. She said it the way you mention weather, a small detail folded into a much bigger story. But it meant she had been watching me, quietly, patiently, for the better part of a year, long before either of us had ever spoken a single word. I brushed it off, the way I brushed off most things back then. Small block, I said. People notice each other around here. That was true enough on its own, but somewhere underneath it, something had already started to take root in me, something I was not ready to look at directly, not that night. Another evening she handed me a coffee, black, no sugar, without once asking how I took it. When I mentioned that, she just shrugged, not quite meeting my eyes. Lucky guess. You didn't strike me as a sweet coffee kind of man. It was not a guess, and some part of me already knew that. She had watched me drink it exactly that way from her father's porch a dozen times over the past year, but neither of us was ready to say that plainly yet, and honestly, I was not ready to ask. She taught me how to recognize the moonflower buds, tightly curled by day like little folded umbrellas, slowly twisting open once true dark had settled in completely, fully open by 10 or 11 at night, right around the exact hour my body always chose to wake me. Look at that, she said one night, nodding toward the vine. Even the flowers wait for you. I started noticing that the nights felt lighter than they used to, not because I was sleeping more, but because I was no longer awake by myself in them. I told her a little about Monica, not much, just enough for her to understand that I had failed at something once and carried the weight of it. She did not offer comfort, and she did not compare notes. She simply said, "Some people don't leave because you weren't enough. They leave because they never learned how to stay." I thought, in the moment, she was only talking about my ex-wife. Looking back now, I understand she was also talking about somebody from her own life, somebody she was not ready to name out loud just yet. The routine kept growing quiet roots of its own. Some nights she told me about her patients, careful never to use names, just small human details. The retired schoolteacher who wanted to hear one more Sunday sermon read aloud, the old fisherman who only wanted the window cracked so he could smell the river one last time. She talked about death the way I imagine a good nurse has to, without flinching, without dressing it up, but never once cold about it either. I started to understand that the same steadiness that let her sit with dying strangers was the same steadiness that let her sit across a fence from a man who woke up shaking most nights, never once looking at me like I was something broken that needed fixing. I started fixing small things around her place without being asked. A sticking gate hinge, a wobbly porch step, the kind of quiet repair that never called for a thank you and never got one out loud, though she always noticed. She started leaving a second mug out on her railing some nights before I had even made it outside, like she had already heard my door open from 2 yards over. Neither of us called any of it anything. We just kept showing up. The first time it rained hard that fall, she waved me in for a few minutes to dry off before I walked back over the fence. On a shelf near her window sat a photograph of her father standing in front of this very house, taken maybe 2 years before that night. In the blurred background, barely visible if you were not looking for it, was a man pushing a wheelbarrow down the walkway. It was me. She had kept that photograph sitting on that shelf since long before she ever moved in next door. I noticed it, and I did not say a word about it. I told myself it was a coincidence too strange to bother mentioning, and I left it there, folded up quiet in the back of my mind. For weeks after that, I kept catching myself glancing at that shelf whenever I stepped inside for a glass of water or to wait out the rain, telling myself I was only being polite, only looking where a guest's eyes naturally land. But some nights, lying awake at 3 in the morning with the ceiling fan turning slow above me, I would think about that wheelbarrow, that blurred shoulder, and wonder how long she had been carrying a version of me around in her head before I ever knew her name. One afternoon, I heard a car pull up outside her house while I was working in the shop, the kind of engine that costs more than most people's rent. A tall man in an expensive coat stepped out, carrying a leather folder tucked under one arm like it already belonged to him. Natalie opened her door, and for one flat second her face went pale before she pulled it back together into something calmer. She did not invite him inside. He spoke loud enough that I could hear him clearly from my own yard. "We need to talk about your father's house, Nat." His name, I would learn soon enough, was Colton Reyes, and not long before that afternoon, he had been engaged to marry her. Weeks before, I had not known he existed at all. Now I was about to learn exactly what kind of man he was, and exactly how far he was willing to go. He had come back for 2 reasons, and neither of them had anything to do with love. The first was money. Colton had lent Natalie $38,000 to help cover her father's hospital bills back when the two of them were still together, and he had never once asked for that money back until now, until he had found a reason worth showing up for again. The second reason was the land itself. The city was quietly planning to widen the road running past Howard Shaw's old property, and that meant the value of this little corner lot was about to triple within a year or two. Colton also carried a second piece of paper, an early draft agreement Howard had signed once, years back, before his illness had truly taken hold, with a page of dates and terms clipped to the back of it. Colton was calling that page Howard's final wish, the thing his dying father-in-law had wanted all along. What he did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Natalie had kept a nursing log through every single day of her father's final stretch, and that log could prove exactly what state her father had been in on the very date written across that page. One morning, Colton caught me on the sidewalk between our 2 houses, all easy smiles and warmth that never once reached his eyes. "Andre, right? Nat's mentioned you. I hear you like to stay up late out in that yard of yours." It was not a threat, not exactly, not in so many words. It was a door left open, just wide enough for me to see that he could walk through it whenever he wanted, and tell the story however suited him best. That is exactly what he started doing, not to my face, but around the block, in the careful, worried tone of a man who claimed he was only looking out for a young woman living alone. He never once said I was dangerous, not outright. He did not have to. He simply laid the pieces down where people could find them. A man living by himself, a former soldier with sleep trouble, standing outside every single night looking toward her yard, and then he let the neighbors connect those dots however they wanted to connect them. I felt the shift almost immediately, the way you feel weather changing before the sky actually turns. Miss Eleanor, who used to knock on my door most Sunday afternoons, started calling ahead first instead, her voice a little too bright, a little too careful. Carl, at the end of the block, stopped raising his hand to wave in the mornings, finding something urgent to check on his own porch whenever our eyes might have met. Nobody said a single word to my face about any of it. Nobody had to. I had spent 11 years learning to read a room for danger, and I knew exactly what it felt like when one had quietly turned against me. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being watched with suspicion by people who used to simply wave. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It just sits in the space where warmth used to be, and you learn to carry your groceries a little faster, keep your eyes down a little longer, until you catch yourself doing it and hate that you have started to. Natalie heard the whispers too, not from Colton directly, but filtered through the same neighbors he had been quietly working on for weeks. She started pulling back from me without any real explanation. No porch light after dark. No more evenings kneeling in the garden. 3 nights in a row, I woke at 11, and looked across the fence, and found nothing but darkness staring back. The moonflower vine went unwatered on its trellis, and slowly began to wilt. I finally caught her during the day and asked her plainly what was going on between us. She did not try to hide it from me. Colton says, if I don't sell the house and pay him back, he'll take it to court, and he'll make sure a judge hears all about the man next door, who stands outside watching my house every night. She looked down at her hands. I don't want to drag you into this, Andre. I was not angry that Colton had threatened me. I was angry that he had taken the quietest, most private part of who I was and turned it into a weapon aimed at both of us, and that Natalie was trying to protect me by cutting herself off instead of letting me stand beside her. I found Colton later that same week and told him plainly, keeping my voice level even though everything in me wanted to raise it. You know exactly what happens on the other side of that fence every night. And you know the story you're telling isn't the real one. So leave me out of it, because I'm not playing whatever game this is. He just smiled, thin and unbothered, hands sliding into his coat pockets like we were discussing the weather. I don't need you to play. I just need you to keep standing right where you're standing. On the outside, looking in. That night, lying awake long past 3, I remembered a man named Tom Haddon, a real estate lawyer I had once restored a mahogany desk for, a couple of years back, before any of this began. Tom had mentioned once, almost in passing, that he handled property records for half the families in Ginter Park, going back decades. I called him the next morning, not looking to be rescued, only to ask one simple question. Did you ever handle anything for a man named Howard Shaw? Did he ever actually sign to sell that property before he passed? It was one short phone call. It was enough to start pulling the whole thing apart. Tom called me back 2 days later, his voice careful and certain at the same time. Howard Shaw had never signed a finalized sale agreement for that property, not once, not anywhere in Tom's files. The paper Colton was carrying around was an early negotiation draft, unnotarized, legally worthless on its own, and the attached page of dates and terms did not exist anywhere in Tom's original record. Somebody had added that page later, and it had not been Howard. I brought the news straight to Natalie. She pulled out her nursing log, the same worn notebook she had kept every single day through her father's final year, recording meals, medication times, how alert he had been each hour, who had come to visit and when. The date written on Colton's page fell squarely inside a stretch when her father had been unconscious for 7 straight days. She was a hospice nurse. She knew precisely what that meant, because her own hand had written it down in real time, hour by hour, while it was actually happening. Natalie called Colton over that evening and laid the notebook and the draft agreement side by side across her kitchen table. She did not raise her voice, not once. Her tone was the same steady calm I imagined she used with grieving families in hospital rooms at 3 in the morning. The date you wrote here, my father hadn't opened his eyes in 7 days. I know because I was the one sitting beside him. You want to call a lawyer, or do you want to walk out on your own? Colton's face went hard and still. He picked up his folder without another word and walked out the door. There was no shouting, no scene, nothing dramatic to it at all. He lost to the truth, plain and simple, not to anybody's fists, and not to mine either. That same night, a light rain began to fall over the block, the kind that comes in soft and steady instead of announcing itself. Around 11 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside my shop, and then Natalie was standing in the doorway, hair plastered to her forehead, holding the photograph of her father against her chest like it might slip out of her hands if she let go, the one with my blurred shape caught in the background. For a moment neither of us said anything. The rain kept ticking against the tin roof above us, and the single bulb hanging over my workbench threw a thin, warm light across the sawdust on the floor. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, and steadier at the same time, like someone who had finally decided to stop carrying something alone. She told me everything then, all of it, standing there dripping just inside my door. All through her father's last year, every single weekend, she drove up from Norfolk, 3 hours each way after a full week of work. She used to see me, sanding wood out on the porch, carrying groceries in for Miss Eleanor, fixing a loose step in the last light of evening, never once looking up, never once speaking to anyone at all. I used to sit in Dad's room after he fell asleep, she said, and I'd watch you out the window instead of watching the ceiling. I never told anyone that. It felt strange to say out loud watching a stranger like that meant something, but some nights it was the only calm part of my whole day. In the most exhausted stretch of her entire life, with her father dying by inches and Colton already halfway out the door by then, the sight of a quiet man doing quiet good, asking nothing at all in return, had become something she held onto without even fully realizing it, the way you hold onto a single steady note in a room full of noise. When Dad passed and left me the house, I could have sold it, could have rented it out and never looked back, never had to drive past this street again. She paused, staring down at the photograph in her hands, her thumb moving slowly over the blurred edge of it. Part of it was for him. I couldn't stand the thought of strangers in his kitchen, but part of it, she said quietly, almost like a confession pulled out of her by force, was because I needed to know if the man I used to see out here was actually real, or if I'd just built him up in my head to survive the worst year of my life. The reason she had given everyone, the reason she had even given me back in the beginning, was that she wanted to keep her father's house standing. That much was true. But it was not the whole truth. And now, finally, standing in the smell of wet wood and rain, I understood the deeper one sitting quietly underneath it. The one she had been circling around for months without ever quite landing on it. I told her my own truth in return, standing there in the doorway with the rain still falling steady behind her. Those nights I stood outside, it was never about watching you. It was that your porch light was the one thing that made the empty nights feel less empty. I've been waking up broken in pieces for 7 years, and somewhere along the way, without asking permission, you became the only reason I didn't mind waking up anymore. I just never knew how to say that out loud without scaring you off, or scaring myself off. She let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. Neither of us moved for a second. Then I reached out and took her hand. It was cold and wet from the rain, and it was shaking a little, or maybe that was me. I did not kiss her that night. I just held on, standing there in the doorway of my own workshop with the rain coming down around us and the smell of sawdust and wet earth filling the space between two people who had finally stopped pretending. For that first night, that was more than enough. We stood there a long while after that, longer than either of us probably meant to, listening to the rain slow down outside the open door. She finally laughed, quiet and a little embarrassed, wiping her face with the back of her free hand, though I could not tell anymore how much of it was rain and how much was something else. I feel ridiculous, she said, standing here soaking wet, telling a man I basically fell for him from across a hospital parking lot before I even knew his name. I told her there was nothing ridiculous about it, that I had spent a year watching a porch light like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to anything, and that made us about even. Before she walked back across the yard that night, she looked back once, just for a second, the way you look at something to make sure it is still there before you let yourself believe it. Word of what happened spread fast once Colton was truly gone. Miss Eleanor was the first to come back. No cookies in her hands this time. Just an apology standing awkwardly in my doorway, her eyes red around the edges. I heard things, and I didn't ask. I was wrong, sweetheart, and I'm sorry. I invited her in for tea. Neither of us needed to say much else after that. Natalie and I never made any grand announcement to anyone on the block. There was no single moment where we started calling it something official. The coffee and tea across the fence simply started lasting longer than they used to, And some evenings, she sat down on my side of the yard instead of staying on hers, her feet tucked up under her the same way, night after night, until it stopped feeling like a choice at all and started feeling like habit. 3 months after that rainy night, the moonflower vine came fully back to life under both our care, blooming heavy right at the start of fall. Natalie walked me through every stage of it, the tightly curled bud, the slow, patient twist as it opened, the full bloom only arriving after true dark had settled all the way in. "It's a little like trust," she told me one evening, fingers brushing a half-open bloom. "Nobody ever sees the exact moment it starts. You only notice once it's already open." Some evenings we cooked together in her kitchen, nothing fancy, pasta or grilled chicken, the radio playing low on the counter while she chopped vegetables, and I stood too close, not really helping, just wanting to be near the sound of her voice while she talked about her day. Other nights I would find her asleep on my porch swing, with a paperback open on her chest, and I would sit down beside her instead of waking her, content just to watch the moonflowers open across the yard while she breathed slow and even next to me. I started teaching her how to plane wood, not to turn her into any kind of carpenter, just because she said she liked the sound of it. She told me it helped her sleep. I laughed and told her that my own insomnia had somehow, against all odds, become her sleeping pill. One evening, I finished restoring the old oak chair that used to belong to her father, the same one he used to sit in every afternoon out on the porch to read. I carried it over myself and set it back exactly where it used to sit, without telling her first. When she got home from her shift and saw it waiting there, she stood completely still for a long moment. She did not cry. She just sat down slowly, ran her hand along the freshly polished armrest, and said, "Dad would have liked you a lot." 6 months after that, I helped her turn Howard's old study into a small reading corner, keeping that same restored oak chair set right at the center of it. The photograph, the one with my blurred shape caught in the background, now hung framed on the wall, but Natalie had cropped and enlarged that section herself, not to erase me out of it, but to give me my own frame right beside her father's. She never explained why she did it that way. I never asked her to. Some things simply do not need words attached to them. We fell into a life that neither of us had planned out loud, but that somehow felt more solid than any plan I had ever made on purpose. Sunday mornings, she made coffee too weak for my taste, and I drank it anyway without complaint. Some evenings I stayed late in the shop and she would bring her laptop out to the porch, charting notes from her shift while I sanded a table leg a few feet away, both of us quiet in the same good way. Miss Eleanor started leaving 2 plates of cookies instead of 1, and never once asked why, just smiled a little wider when she handed the second plate over the fence. On the anniversary of her father's passing that year, she asked me to sit with her on the porch instead of going out. We didn't talk much. I just held her hand while she looked out at the yard, and when the moonflowers started opening around 9, she squeezed my fingers once and said, "He would have liked watching this with us." I didn't say anything back. I just squeezed her hand in return, and we sat there until the whole vine had opened, white and glowing faintly under the porch light, saying nothing else that needed saying. My sleep never fully healed, and I have come to accept that maybe it never fully will. There are still nights the ringing in my ear gets loud enough to pull me straight up out of bed. Still nights I sit on the edge of the mattress with my hands pressed flat against my knees, waiting for my heart to remember it is not in danger anymore. But now, when I wake somewhere in the middle of the night, there is a hand that finds my back in the dark without a word, just letting me know I am not carrying any of it alone anymore. Natalie never once tried to fix me. She never asked me to be anything other than what I already was. She simply stayed, night after night, the way the moonflower keeps opening whether anyone is watching or not. Some nights now, I manage 4 full hours of sleep in a row, the longest stretch I had managed in 7 years, and I still remember the first morning I woke up and realized I had slept clean through until sunrise and just lay there for a while, almost afraid to move in case it broke. A full year after that first night at the fence, right at the height of moonflower season, I decided to take down the entire section of wooden fence, separating our 2 yards. It took me most of a Saturday, pulling each old post out of the ground one at a time, stacking the weathered boards to the side, while Natalie brought out lemonade and pretended not to watch me sweat through my shirt. In its place, I built a long bench out of restored oak, the same careful joinery I use on every piece that comes through my shop, set right along the old property line, half on my side, half on hers. No more fence standing between us. Just a bench and a trellis heavy with white blooms opening wide above it every single night. Natalie sat down beside me on that bench, her shoulder settling naturally against mine. Nothing like that very first night, when I had stood on one side of a wooden line and she had stood on the other, and she had been the one who had to invite me over. There was no invitation needed anymore, no fence left standing to cross, no reason required at all, not for either of us. Looking back on all of it now, from this bench, in this yard, I understand something I could not have understood back when I was still standing on the other side of that fence. People are afraid of the dark. Afraid of sleepless nights, of loneliness, of feelings they cannot quite bring themselves to say out loud, even to themselves. I was afraid too, for longer than I like to admit. I used to stand on my side of that fence every single night, watching her light glow through the gap, telling myself it was none of my business. But moonflowers do not bloom in daylight. They need the dark to open at all, every single time, without exception. And maybe some things in life work the exact same way, only opening once we finally stop trying to drag them out into the light too soon, and just sit long enough in the dark beside them to actually see what they are. She never once caught me spying on her that night. She was only waiting, patiently, for me to finally be brave enough to cross over on my own. I do not stand on my side of the fence anymore. There is no fence left standing between us at all. Just a bench, a trellis of white flowers opening every night, and the woman who had been waiting for me longer than I ever once knew. If this story made you think of someone you have never had the courage to walk toward, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me down in the comments, what do you think that moonflower vine looks like now?